Project management students, today we're going to be talking about Chapter 11, Risk Management. We all say, there are several types of people. There are people who are risk takers, there are people who are not risk takers, and there are people who fall out right in the middle. Organizations are the same way, and so are projects. Some projects have more inherent risk than others. Generally speaking, the greater the risk, the greater the reward. We do, however, want to be aware of the risks we are facing when we take them on in project management. So our objectives here in this particular chapter are to talk about how risk affects projects. How do we mitigate risk? How do we manage it? You can't eliminate risk completely, but you can manage it. So how can we in an organization make sure that we are taking steps to identify, to predict the risks we're likely to encounter, and to be able to mitigate them? We're also going to talk about different ways of analyzing risk and documenting it so that we can put it in front of us. Think about this. When we have things that we don't know or don't understand, it helps to document them and write them down. It helps to be able to anticipate what areas we're going to be dealing with so we can make preparation to do so. How do we train our staffs to be able to be prepared to deal with risk? We're also going to talk about the difference between qualitative and quantitative risk analysis, things like decision trees, how we're able to document and prepare for these kinds of risks and have strategies in place to respond to them. We're also going to talk how we monitor these risks. We're talking about monitoring our project as well, and how the software and tools that we use can help us in this regard as well. So why is risk management important? Well, if you think about a project, if you've done something once or twice, you know in some sense, in most projects, in most areas of life, where you might run into problems. For example, if I'm driving to work every day and I live in central Pennsylvania, I have a risk that on a given December or January day, I may have to encounter snow. That means that during those seasons of the year, I probably prepare to drive to work a little earlier so I can give myself some contingency time to be able to make it to work. People who overlook risk in projects, for example, sometimes create estimates of schedule or cost that are overly optimistic, meaning that we have given false expectations for stakeholders. So why is it important? It's important to be able to build in realistic schedules and cost estimates, for example. So the risks are documented, or I should say that the risks of not documenting risks have been documented to show that basically people are overly optimistic when we promote aggressive timelines, aggressive cost schedules, things that simply do not go as well as we wish they would. We have to see what would possibly derail our project work. Sometimes it's really tough to anticipate where these risks are going to be coming from. Let me give you an example. If we had a scenario where we're creating devices that rely on rare earth elements, for example, those that come from Japan or Africa, and there was an earthquake, and all of a sudden these ports of entry where we normally get these products are no longer available, what would we do? That's exactly what happened, by the way. During the earthquake and the tsunami of 2011, a rare earth element that was used in black paint on Ford pickup trucks was no longer available because it came from one place on planet Earth, and that was the area of Japan where the Fukushima reactor was. So for several months, nobody could get that color of black paint. The same kinds of issues affected supply chains for things like iPads, for example, and other devices that required very specific technology because the manufacturers had not come up with a contingency plan to be able to provide continuity of operations. Those are risks that we have to consider. Although nobody may have considered that there was going to be a tsunami in Japan after that event, so people like Apple and Ford had alternative plans for supply chains to mitigate that risk. So in terms of problems that we might be able to encounter, if you look at some of the research, the reason we do risk management, the reason companies do risk management is really the biggest reason. 80% of companies responding to this survey basically said they wanted to be able to predict what the problems would be and be able to counter them, I should say, to make sure we're not being surprised. And if you get more and more technical and more specific as we move on down the line, we want to make sure that we are making our customers happy, that we're staying within scope of the project, and that we're not going over budget. When we're talking about tight cost margins in the modern workplace, we should be able to predict, or at least make a reasonable attempt to predict, where our areas of risk are. So what are the global issues? Well, we talked about some of those already, that many of our supplies, many of the things we need are coming from a global marketplace that's affected by economic downturns, environmental impact, even wars and conflicts. Those are things we need to be able to anticipate so we can build risk tolerance plans to get around these issues, or at least come up with ways for continuity of operations. So in terms of what risk even means, the dictionary says that risk is the possibility of loss or injury. If we're talking about a project, we're talking about something that could affect our ability to meet schedule, cost, the triple constraint, time, cost, and scope. If it's a risk, it can make the project go longer in time. Remember, we have no control over the variable of time it passes. We can't stop it. Cost, meaning how much we're spending, or scope, how big the project is. So if we're managing negative risks, that means that we are managing things that could derail our project plan. Positive risk management, on the other hand, is saying, are there areas where things could go not as planned that we can leverage, for example, for better outcomes? So if we are in an earthquake zone where we're operating, an example of positive risk management would be, well, what if there's an earthquake and the ground splits open and we discover that we have oil and gold on our property? Well, the example there would be positive risk management might be ensuring we have the mineral and petroleum rights for our property if we know that's a possibility. So that's an example of positive risk management. So some folks, for example, some companies make big mistakes by only looking at the negative and tactical issues. Tactical meaning operational, daily issues. If we're not looking at risks as opportunities, then we're missing the boat. Companies who, for example, take a risk on a new approach or a new technology or an area they had not explored before often win big. Apple, for example, when they created the first iPhone in 2007, was not in that market. And they took a risk that was presented to them in the form of an opportunity because other manufacturers such as BlackBerry and, believe it or not, Kyocera were already coming out with smartphones. So the risk for them was an opportunity. It was a positive risk to get involved in that market. You've got to have people who have a tolerance for risk in that regard. So in terms of risk utility, that means the amount of satisfaction or pleasure received from a potential payoff. In other words, if we are risk averse and we come up with project management plans or risk mitigation plans to help us feel better at night, then we have a high level of utility here. Those who have a high tolerance for risk like the idea of gambling on high stakes. So those who are risk seeking have a higher tolerance for risk. And people who are risk neutral basically want a balance between risk and payoff. So people who are averse to risk like having plans in place. They like having security blankets. People who are thrill seekers like to be able to play high stakes games and high levels of risk. They like to gamble. People who are somewhere in the middle have a medium tolerance. So here's an example of risk utility function versus risk preference in terms of folks who see a potential payoff, who are risk averse, may put more time into plans that mitigate risk instead of trying to leverage risk, as opposed to somebody who is risk seeking. So things to think about in terms of taking risks. When we are first starting in our project management path, when we are young, dare I say, a lot of folks are very reticent to take risks. They don't want to screw up too early because they want to look like they have a track record of success. I think it makes sense to be a little conservative when you start as a project manager. Once you build some bona fides, then you can start taking bigger risks. It's also important to know what your company's philosophy is toward failure. If your company, for example, supports the idea of trial and error and learning from your mistakes, then you may have support for more aggressive project management styles than other companies or very financially conservative groups. So think about your company, know who you're dealing with before you get into taking high-risk types of approaches. So why is project management risk important? Well, here's some of the other processes. We plan to mitigate risk. We want to be able to identify, if you think long and hard, you can probably determine what some of your known unknowns are, for example. Qualitative risk analysis means that we are looking at the probability of something happening and prioritizing. Quantitative means we're estimating what the impacts of those risks, if they came to pass, might actually be. Planning risk response means we're getting ready to be able to have a plan in place if the worst possible things happen. And we also want to implement those. For example, if we have a project that goes over budget, do we have a project or managerial reserve we can tap into? We're implementing that risk response. And finally, we want to monitor how we are encountering and dealing with risks. So our first step in this process is to plan risk management. So in other words, we're coming up with what we refer to as a risk management plan, which is part of our project plan. So we should be able to have the whole team together to look at what we've experienced in the past with similar projects. And there might also be templates already in our organization to be able to determine if we've encountered similar risks in similar projects in the past. Getting your stakeholders is important too, particularly your project sponsor. What kind of tolerance do you have for risk within your organization? In other words, the folks who have put their money and their social capital behind this project, are they prepared for failure if it's part of the deal? So contingency plans mean that we have a plan to fall back. A contingency plan doesn't mean we are scrambling at the last minute to counter the risk. It means we've come up with a plan to be able to respond to risk as it happens. So a contingency plan is not something that's improvised. It's something that we've written down. Then we've got fallback plans, which means if we've got risks that could really, really hit us hard, that we've got emergency measures we can put in place if the contingency plans fail. So for example, the United States government has a number of level of communication systems in the event of a major war. So let's say, for example, our first communication system is hit, and we have a backup digital communication system. That actually, by the way, was why the internet was invented, as a redundant communications network. Our contingency, or our fallback plan might be to go to an old vintage radio system that's not affected by modern weapons. So a fallback plan is kind of like the second layer of contingency. When we say we have contingency reserves or allowances, we've built some money into the budget to be able to use in the event that we have schedule or cost overruns. These are known potential areas of risk. Management reserves are unknown funds. In other words, we keep that money in for things that we have not anticipated. So for example, if I am developing a new smartphone, I may be able to predict that our screens may be more expensive 10 years from now than they are now. So I've built in additional funds to be able to pay for screens that are more expensive than we're predicting that they might be now. That would be kind of a known potential risk. I'd use contingency reserves for that. If all of a sudden our entire supplier got wiped out in a natural disaster, something we could have never predicted, I might be using management reserves to buy those screens from an entirely new supplier who I don't even know yet. Somebody who is new to the project because we didn't need them until our first supplier got wiped out. So contingency funds are used to back up and to mitigate risks that we knew we might have. Management reserves are kind of like your dad or mom coming in to save you when you overspent your allowance because you didn't know that you were going to do so. So in terms of some of the methodology and roles and responsibilities, these are all parts of what we refer to as a risk management plan. So if we are talking about the methodology of risk management, how are we going to communicate? This crosses over a little bit with our communications management. How are we going to communicate with management on this? Roles and responsibility, who's going to do what in the event of a risk coming to light? Budget and schedule, what are the impacts and how are we going to mitigate these particular ideas? Risk categories, how are we breaking down categories of risk? Are we talking about software development? Are we talking about hardware? The probability and impact, what's the likelihood something is going to happen and how hard is it going to hit us? What about stakeholders' tolerances? What we would do in this regard would be, in the life cycle of the project, a stakeholder who is initially risk averse, if they're seeing potential profit, for example, may decide they've got a higher tolerance for risk than they originally thought they had. How are we going to track our risk activities and how we're mitigating them, and how we're going to document the entire response to these risks as well. That's all a risk management plan. So what are common sources of risk when we get into IT projects? Well, we're talking about the markets. The markets can shift, for example. If you were a smartphone manufacturer, prior to the arrival of Apple, you had very little competition if you were BlackBerry or Kyocera. All of a sudden, Apple changes the entire game with things like apps and app stores and ways to download music, and all of a sudden you are completely out of your element in the market you used to dominate. Financial risk. So do we have the risk of having to pay more for supplies? Technology risk. Is the technology going to vastly change? For example, prior to smartphones, prior to the cell phone revolution, there still was a market for home telephones. Well, if you were making most of your profit of making wall phones for homes, or God help you, pay phones, the technological risk has not worked out in your favor. People risk. Do we have the risk of losing key staff members in the middle of the project? What about the structure and process risk? Do we have a flawed process in place, or do we have the right project management and structure in place? And we have a risk breakdown that we can put all these into a hierarchy of how the risks might affect the project. So here's an example of a risk breakdown structure in terms of how we break this down for business, technical, organizational, project management. And you can use any kind of headings you wanted on this depending on what was relevant for your particular project. So in terms of the knowledge areas between project integration management scope, etc., these are a pretty good example of risks that could apply to those areas. I think this is one when we talk about stakeholders, for example. If we are not communicating well with our key stakeholders, the risk could be that we have a disenfranchised sponsor and somebody who's not going to support us in the project. The carelessness in communications planning could be a risk in that area. If we, for example, in quality management, aren't taking our approaches to quality seriously, that could affect us as well. All of these are ways that we could have risk in technology projects. Actually, a lot of these apply to just any kind of project management in general. Now, a lot of the time in industry, in the United States and beyond, we fail to really prepare for risk. Sometimes these failures to prepare can result in lost funds, slipped scopes on projects. Unfortunately, they can also result in injury to the general public as well. The Ford Motor Company in the early 1970s produced a car called the Pinto. The Pinto was a small, fuel-efficient vehicle designed to compete with imports in the oil crisis. Now, the car had one fatal flaw. The gas tank on the back of the car was positioned between the rear bumper and the frame, and consequently, when you rear-ended the car in an accident, the car would burst into flames. An internal memo was found circulating at Ford that did a cost-benefit analysis of whether it was better to let people die in flaming car wrecks versus recalling the cars, and which was a more financially sound approach. Ford determined it was better to pay out settlements to the few people they anticipated would be killed in the accident. In addition to showing the coldest, hardest heart of American industry, this did not do wonders for Ford's public image. So in this case, the risk mitigation plan was not adequate either from a humanitarian or a corporate level. So in terms of identifying risks, what we want to be able to look at is to try to anticipate where our areas of risk are. How can we determine where our areas of risk are? If you've done this project before, or a similar project before, I should say, there may be people in your organization who know what might go wrong. It makes sense to listen to people who have been involved in previous projects and to try to determine where the areas of risk are. So how can we determine where we have areas of risk? There's lots of ways that we can engage our staff and our project team in this regard. Brainstorming simply means you get together and talk about it. If we are able to play out scenarios, to be able to spitball ideas where are areas we could run into problems, it's not a bad starting point. I think the only bad part about this is it can turn into something very unstructured, and by the time that we are done talking, sometimes the problem we started addressing no longer is represented in reality. So we really need to take a structured approach. I think brainstorming is a good first step, but I would also suggest having a facilitator. And sometimes having a facilitator who's not even part of your organization can help, because that person can disconnect from their own personal feelings on the subject. The Delphi technique is a technique that we use basically to have people come to consensus. It's similar to brainstorming, but essentially by the time you walk out of the meeting, there is consensus by the attendees of what the areas of risk are and what we should be putting in our risk register, for example. Interviewing. It's a great idea to talk to people who've worked in the field, who've worked in related areas to your project, to see what have you seen. If you have colleagues, you can call up and ask questions. hey, Joe, who is working over in computer company B, you did a similar project a few years ago. What areas of risk did you run into? What were the things that destroyed your scope or your budget, for example? So it's a great way to be able to find that information. Why not interview people? SWOT analysis is a classic. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Again, it's a way to frame the information you're trying to get from individuals in terms of what your risks might be. It's a classic in terms of a way to identify risks. So the risk register means we've got a place to be able to document what our risks are, and to put them in a place where we can refer to them and quantify them and qualify them, so that we're able to look and say, well, yeah, this makes sense. This is an area of risk for us. Let's be aware of it. Let's turn these into known unknowns, for example, in terms of our risks. So what's on a risk register? Basically, anything that we quantify or qualify the risk. What is the risk? What causes it? Under what conditions does it occur? What makes this risk actually come to pass? If this risk does come to pass, what implications does it have? Who's responsible for it? And how important is it to identify and have a contingency to deal with this risk? We document this information in what we refer to as a risk register. And you can see we rank the risk based on the highest to lowest, and that's based on how much potential impact these risks could have on our project. What are the most important risks? It could be that, for example, if you've got a very time-sensitive project that absolutely has to be delivered on time and on schedule, your biggest risk is anything that would implement the project late or get in the way of the schedule. So the rank is the first part. The risk itself gets described. What's the name of it? Let's describe the risk. What is the risk that we're dealing with? What category is it? Is it software? Is it hardware? Is it schedule? What's the root cause of this risk? Is it competition from someone else? Is it lack of available staff? What's the trigger? The trigger could be staff committed to other projects, for example. What are our potential responses? Well, could be freeing up some contingency reserves to hire contractors. Who owns this risk? So is it in the software or the hardware department? What's the probability of this coming to pass? Is it a high probability or low probability? What's the impact? Well, the impact could be it could slow down our schedule. And what's our status? Have we dealt with it, or has it not come to pass yet? That's an example. So the risk register are your best attempts at documenting what your risks might be, what would trigger them, and how you would respond to them. So in terms of what the risk register contents are, we just talked about those, but we really want to be able to have some level of prediction of what risk is going to occur and how and what drives it. So we start off thinking about how to do qualitative risk analysis. What we're really trying to determine is what is the likelihood some of these risks are going to come to pass. How do we do this? How do we come up with some ideas for qualitative risk analysis? We can use some quantitative tools to do that. We can do a probability or impact matrix. We can do top 10 risks. We can basically say what are the possibilities that these risks are going to come to pass. What are the top 10 possible risks? And we can ask people who have worked in similar projects what they've seen come to pass in the past. So in terms of using a probability or an impact matrix, what we do basically is put the probability on one side of the matrix and try to come up with what the relative likelihood is. So we list the risks and say, are they high or medium, low in terms of the probability that they're going to happen and what kind of impact they're going to have. In terms of calculating the risk factors, well, that's, again, coming back to trying to determine what's going to play into this risk actually coming to pass. So here's an example of a probability and impact matrix. So we've got, for example, if we've got a risk that has a high probability but a low impact, here we are. The ones we really want to be concerned about are the ones that are high probability and high impact, for example. Those are the risks that could be catastrophic for our project. So we list them in a matrix like this where we can actually illustrate and see what the low probability, low impact risks are all the way up to high probability, high impact. And if you're lucky, you don't have any in this corner. So in terms of what we can also do, we can put this into a chart as well, a scatter diagram. It all comes down to how you want to document it. And again, programs like Microsoft Excel do a wonderful job with this stuff. A number of chart generators are available in Microsoft products as well. So it's always good to try to put into some sort of graphical representation how your risks could possibly play out. So in terms of top 10 risk tracking, when we start talking about this, we're going back and having reviews to determine what risks have actually come to pass. The top 10 risks may change over time. When you're in the planning phase of the project, for example, you may have a less well-defined idea what your risks are than when you are in execution and new risks are eliciting themselves. For example, using the discussion we had earlier, once you're into project execution, you may not have realized you were going to run into a problem with a supplier literally disappearing. So that would be a new risk. And so we're essentially creating a rotating list that we update periodically to say what are our top 10 problems that we're having. Here's a simple example how you might be able to track your top 10 using a simple table or chart, for example. And again, very easy to generate in a program like Microsoft Word or PowerPoint. So in terms of risk, the reason our text includes the idea of the Titanic, it's like the ultimate example of designers not really understanding what they were up against and making the boastful statement that nothing can sink their ship. When in reality, sometimes no matter how big you anticipate the icebergs to be in life, they can be bigger. That's a lesson that is learned. So PMI actually has something called the Titanic factor, and that is realizing that, yes, the worst possible risks can come to pass. So what about quantitative risk analysis? We talked about qualitative, but in terms of quantifying risks, there's several approaches you can use. There's what we refer to as decision tree analysis, simulation, and sensitivity analysis. So let's talk about these. In terms of a decision tree or an EVM type approach, it basically means we're mapping out what the monetary value could be if risks elicited themselves and actually came to pass. So we can do an illustration of these, what we refer to as a decision tree. So let's say, for example, we've determined for project 1, we've got a 20% chance we're going to see an EVM of $300,000. Pretty good. We'd love to get that. And we've got an 80% chance we're going to see a negative EVM of $40,000, negative $40,000. So if we apply 20% to $300,000, we get $60,000. If we apply 80% to negative $40,000, we get negative $32,000. Similarly, we've got 3 potential outcomes in project 2. We've got a 20% chance that we're going to lose $50,000. We've got a 10% chance we're going to lose $20,000. But we've got a 70% chance we're going to make $60,000. So 20% of 50,000, negative 50,000 is 10,000. 10% of negative 20,000 is 2,000. And 70% of 60,000 is 42,000. So if we do the math, we can see rather that project 2, even with all these potential outcomes, has a higher EVM than project 1, even though some of the figures that are at play here, the greatest potential likelihood of $300,000, which only is a 20% likelihood, because of the potential payoff being lower in total, project 2 still seems like a safer bet. Now, keep this in mind when we're looking at this method of management. We're also talking about extenuating factors as well. Somebody, for example, may still choose project 1 because they have a high tolerance for risk and may say, well, we're going to gamble on the 20% chance we're going to make $300,000. Somebody a little more conservative might go with a 70% chance that they're going to make $42,000. So again, it comes down to tolerance for risk. So in terms of simulation, guys, your own organization may use something like Monte Carlo analysis or other kinds of computer simulations to be able to play out the various potentials. When we get into things like modeling software, for example, and software that will play out various scenarios in software development, it comes down to what your organization is using. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Monte Carlo, not because it's not important, but because it's something that's organization specific. And in this regard, you would basically come up with most likely optimistic and pessimistic estimates and really try to determine, after a few passes through the model, which is most likely to come to pass. And again, anybody who's finance major has probably at least played with Monte Carlo analysis in general. The takeaway point is that we're using the most positive, most negative, and the middle ground type estimates to perform these simulations and calculations. So in terms of our quantitative risk analysis, whether you are using a program specific to Monte Carlo or a general spreadsheet type of software, you can do things like EVM very quickly, as we demonstrated in previous chapters as well. So next we're going to talk about sensitivity analysis. Sensitivity analysis is a generic way to say we're going to play with variables and see which ones have the most effect on a project. We can really do this even with programs like Microsoft Project when we start playing with things like schedule to see how one item slipping on the schedule will affect everything that comes behind it. You can use spreadsheet software such as Microsoft Excel for this as well. So again, we can explore if we had different levels of revenue and expenses at different times, where would our break-even point be? And again, I don't mean to glaze over this, but there are just all different ways to be able to play with variables to see how one affects the other to determine where the greatest areas of risk are. So how do we plan how we're going to respond to risks? If you've got negative risks, things that could derail the project, well, we can avoid them, we can accept them, we can give them to somebody else, we can hire a subcontractor, for example, we can mitigate them by taking them on, or we can escalate them by putting more resources against them. If we got positive risks, it all comes down to how do we leverage those to our own benefit. So for example, if I accepted the risk that I might have an earthquake on my property, and there is, and I discovered there's gold in them there hills, how would I make best use of that? I would probably enhance that risk by hiring people to come in and dig the gold for me. So in terms of planning risks as well, there's technical cost and schedule risks, and these are ways to deal with those. If it's a technical risk, it comes down to teamwork and resolving the problem from a technical level. If it comes down to a cost risk, we can look at things like our work breakdown structure to determine where our costs are going to be anyway, and also to give the project manager some authority and maybe even some contingency funds or even managerial reserves to be able to deal with these kinds of problems. And again, with the schedule, we're going to be able to look at things like our work breakdown structure to determine where our schedule risks are greatest anyway. And have more experienced project managers, people who've done projects before, know how to get things back on schedule as well. So it's also important to think about things that maybe don't come across as primary risks. So once you've put all your strategies in place, do you have a residual risk? Well, it could be a residual risk that your company is on such shaky footing you don't know if it's going to exist by the time your project is done. And does implementing a risk response, create another risk? Well, if your risk is that you're implementing a contingency or management reserve, your risk is those funds are no longer there, that if you have another financial emergency. So funds are limited. So in terms of implementing risk responses, we basically at this point are in the process of executing a project. That means we've got to put in requests for these risk responses, whether it's funds or additional staff, things that are mitigating the risk, and we got to update our project documents as well. Monitoring basically means we're watching to see how the risk is being resolved and determining if there are other steps we need to put into place. There are also sometimes things called workarounds, and that means project teams sometimes fail to anticipate a risk or it didn't make it into the documentation, and so you've got a local workaround. We see it oftentimes in software that maybe a menu button didn't get created, but we can tell end users how to get to a specific area of the software, for example. In terms of using project management software, again, we talked about the idea of Monte Carlo analysis. Honestly, you can use risk registers created in Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, or they can be things that are, for example, real-time parts of enterprise project management systems like Microsoft Project as well. So things to think about with agile and adaptive software. I think we're seeing it all the time, that sometimes risks can come up very quickly because you're operating so quickly. And oftentimes you're operating in an environment where you cannot possibly anticipate the risks that quickly because you're developing partially completed products, and oftentimes we simply cannot anticipate in the same level of detail as we would in predictive project planning. So the bottom line is risk is part of project management, and it's something that we have to deal with. The more proactive we can be in terms of coming up with proper ways to deal with risks and plan for them, the better off we can possibly make plans to be able to counter those risks with resources and approaches. And again, we've got to prepare for that. We've got to assess them. We've got to build funds in, and we have to monitor our own responses. Folks, thank you for your time and attention. Have a great day.